So today,
Okay.
like in most modern democratic countries, they formally subscribe to the rule of law, and one of the fundamental pillars of the rule of law is legal clarity and certainty. The determinacy of the law enables us to use it as a guide and places judges in the position to decide impartially. Vagueness apparently poses a threat to these ideals, and in borderline cases, the law seems to be indeterminate and thus incapable of serving its core value of the rule of law. And also, vagueness appears to give judges the opportunity to take advantage of linguistic accidents to undermine the results of the democratic process. On the other hand, we can't always have these sort of very precise sort of expressions in statutes, because they could be very arbitrary and they won't serve the purpose of the law enacted. So, what do you think is the role? First of all, what is like how does vagueness manifest itself in law, and is it different from just ordinary natural language? And what are the problems that you think it poses for us? You know.
Well, I think it manifests a little bit with ordinary people. If you're forced to answer certain questions and you don't know. So when you're filling out forms, for instance, they don't have like I don't know often, and they won't let you proceed unless you say something. And so that's a forced choice kind of situation, and that's one of the unpleasant things of filling out so many forms, to get access to computer software and so forth, or to deal with the medical world or so forth. So one of the things what the law is supposed to do is judge is supposed to be decisive.
Yeah.
So you have a conflict, and and you haven't been able to resolve it in other ways. And so the judge has to answer the question. So ordinary people and the judge in ordinary circumstances can just shrug his shoulders and I don't know.
Yeah.
And so if you take that option away, then people will wind up, they're going to have to answer insincerely. So in the case, one of my favorite cases is the European Union, and they're trying to make a decision as to whether Jaffa cakes are biscuits, what Americans call cookies, or cakes. And there's a different tax depending on what choice you make. And so they wanted more tax money, and so they made a judgment. The tax people, it was appealed, lots of money at stake. So you need some judges, and the judges are assembled. But if you've seen the Jaffa cakes, it's just sort of a borderline case. You could call them cakes, you could call them biscuits. It's just in between, sort of, But if you're a judge, you can't just say, I have no insight in this. I mean, so one of the things you can do ordinarily is you flip a coin or something, if you can't have to move on. But the judge's not allowed to do that. The judge cannot use a random device. The EU judges, and there's a whole panel. Imagine yourself on this panel, making these millions of euros at stake. It's a serious issue here. So you got to make a call on it. And then you have to, what are the guidelines of, well, you have to also give reasons.
Yeah.
And you can't just say, well, my opinion, it has to be a reasoned judgment. And so hilariously, they do it. And they have like 9 reasons, and they'll also careful what's not a reason, just because they call Jaffa cakes, we can't conclude they are cakes, and there's all this officiousness. And so the stuff was posted on the internet, and people are very amused at the judges who are just phonies, and going through this ridiculous procedure. But then put yourself in the judge's position. It's important that you have a decisive answer. You have to resolve conflicts. That's the primary thing you got to do, is resolve conflict. But you're not allowed to use these other methods. We can't flip coins. We can't say, I don't know unless I'm along. You have to claim you do know. And with the case of the judge, you've got to give reasons. But you clearly don't know. It's a borderline case. That's the problem. And I think this is a source of judicial insincerity. It's not that I'm blaming the judges. I'm not saying I would behave differently. I would be just as phony as they were, but it's just it's an occupational phoniness. I mean, it's more hilarious because what happens is they have to be taken seriously. So suppose I see you giggling in the audience, as I start to go through my reasons and so on. Contempt of court for you, and then and I'll make sure I have my black robes on, and you have to have a lot of respect, So anyway, that's what creates this a kind of absurd situation. So you have the aspirational level that you're making a solemn, important decision on a serious matter, millions of euros at stake. It's pretty transparent to everybody, I think, that no one knows the answer or could know. There are parallel cases in the United States where people are trying to make decisions as to whether something is a sandwich or not, some sort of burrito or something is a sandwich.
Yeah.
And you will sometimes have, the judge they can't say, I don't know. And then I think that in one case, the judge did seem to think he knew. And that would make it just even more hilarious, although it gets by the problem. Maybe he wasn't lying, but then he wasn't a very rational judge. Mm-hmm. So you can either be incompetent and get your way through it sincerely, or if you're competent, you have to be insincere. And then judges don't like it. It isn't a normal situation where insincerity is okay. It wasn't like, you're being polite or something like that, or we're telling jokes. I've been abused in some way, and I got cornered into this conversation, so I got to lie my way out. It's not like that with a judge. It's a serious matter. They invite and indeed demand your respect on their decision. They have to project that they know the answer. They can admit it's a difficult one. That's why I'm a well-paid judge, you see. And I look at all and I have to go through this so that's the kind of farcical aspect as well. But anyway, it's a difficult situation,
Yes. Do you think it's a problem with the expression themselves? We can replace them? Do you think it's about what sort of theory we have about what sort of word meanings? Are they stereotypes, prototypes, a set of necessary and sufficient conditions? Do we just stipulate the definition so just we can get on with our lives? Where do you locate the problem?
I think it'll be, it's inevitable that even if we use stipulations, we'll use terms that are vague. And we'll just relocate where the difficulties are. Even if we substitute a word such as being an 18-year-old for being an adult, for instance, there are going to be borderline cases of being 18 years old. There was one case where someone committed the crime, I think on their birthday, and then it was calculated out by the prosecution that he's an adult, and there's another rule that he's not adult, So anyway, I think it's inevitable. It's it's a moral dilemma. It's a kind of a tragedy that's general to all adjudication. So for sports, the same thing. Where you're an umpire. If you're an umpire, you have to be decisive. You have to make calls. You're trained up to see things correctly, to know what a strike or a ball is in baseball or something. So there's that's that improvement, and you can be very attentive to it, and you're supposed to be. But you have to make the judgments very quickly, so you don't ruin the rhythm of the game. Judges, at least, they can retire to their chambers, and they can kind of, consult, stuff. But it's all the same sort of thing. I think it's that they're going to be borderline cases, it's just the price of working with ordinary language. I don't think we're not going to be able to improve upon it with a logically perfect language that is free of vagueness, because I don't think we'll be able to get there. Something that will work for ordinary reasoning. So you're just stuck with it. That's my view. It's like it's like the moral dilemmas one will get into if you decide to become a physician. So you'll get into situations where you'll sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah,
I think that's not there are those situations, and they'll happen. This is not a reason to avoid the profession of medicine, as I think Ruth Marcus at one point thought. Well, then you should avoid professions in which it's inevitable you'll be put into these moral dilemmas.
Yeah,
echoing Geach or something. That seems silly. I mean, it's important that they be physicians. It's important that they be judges. They're playing a really important role.
Yeah.
But because people don't like this moral dilemma, they look for ways of getting out that I think don't work, and they will claim they'll make claims on behalf of the vagueness, which I don't think are correct. For instance, they'll claim that the vagueness is functional. They'll say it's serving some good end.
Yeah.
And I think we can readily understand that if we're a supervaluationist, these people who think are truth value gaps. So the picture is this: that we don't want law to, we don't make kind of over legislate in ignorance of how the facts are going to be. So we want to have some flex in the law, and we will make it more precise gradually in light of new information and in light of new interests. And maybe we kind of change our minds on values and so forth, and then we will fill in the gaps as we go along. So this is a view, incidentally, this is not going to be different from a divine command theory of legal judgment. Divine command theory says, well, God knows all the answers. And what the judge's job is to match God's judgment. Now, he's only a human being, and so he's going to make mistakes. But there is an answer. And maybe if you pray or something, you can get guidance as to what the answer is or something. So in some legal systems, that's what you're supposed to do. And ones where you're going to have, some Islamic systems, I think, some fringe ones, they do think you should be praying on these matters and trying to be, your piety will guide you through. You might get some insight. And you should be pious. Mostly no. I mean, that's mostly a caricature of what really is going on. Most, people are pretty realistic. They're not thinking that they're going to get all that much divine guidance, and that the judge is going to have to. They're going to be these hard cases, and what's really going to go on is sometimes there really isn't any. The judge will just have to say it, he's not. So that shows you they're not really, or they may think, well, maybe there is an answer that God's come up with on divine. He knows, but it's just not accessible. Maybe it's important that God not make it accessible, I guess, and maybe promote our autonomy or something. I'm not going to tell you. Boy, you would like God to tell you. So maybe it's important that God not tell you, make a mystery of it. But they're worried about, well, you mean maybe I now risk this guy getting executed or something? You mean he didn't do it? And it's like it's supposed to be maturing or something for me. Seems bad. It's a difficult situation. And so in the West, basically, it's kind of operational. They just sort of set aside the reliance on theism. So they they can be theists themselves, but then they say, well, that doesn't enter in. I can't have like my distinctive religious views affect what's going on. So that's the role. Catholic judges, for instance, that's their official line. They may know, they think that, say, abortion is wrong, but they can't rely on that.
Yeah.
They could rely on other things to get the same result. They can't get it on that. So they are clear on that, because if they did that, then they would not get hired as judges, because that would be too out of line with the basically secular background, how the U.S. was sort of set up. You know, it's become more. There's a lot more religion in it now than it was in the beginning. But that would be too much. That you would. So I think what goes on is it becomes pretty attractive. This other kind of secular views think actually. So you could think there's hidden answers, and maybe for some reason your theology you can't get to in that way. Well, then classical logic could work out just fine. I don't really think that's so, but even that's not great for you, right? Because you're still in the position where you're making an important assertion about the innocence or guilt of someone, and you don't know. So it's not any kind of better, you know. Now, if you thought that, if you kind of relax that picture and you think, well, maybe there really isn't any determined answer, then you might think, well, this is an appropriate arena for invention. I will fill in the gap myself as a judge. And this is one of the theories of judicial discretion. The judge doesn't just sort of try to read off what maybe God had in mind, or what is somehow platonically in you know, the right answer or something like that. No, the judges on these cases is inventing. And what guides the invention may be things like his views on social policy. It could be, you know, all kinds of considerations, the kind of considerations you use when you're no longer trying to discover the answer, but you're coming up with what would be the nicest thing for me to say. You know, so you've shifted around quite a bit now, because the original question you were asked, well, is this person innocent or guilty? And now you kind of shifted around to a different one. Well, would it be nicer for me to say?
Yeah.
That's a topic change. And then so it looks like it's disingenuous in that way, because you're not allowed to say, I'm doing it because of my views of social policy.
Yeah. And
then as you just speak it out loud, wait a minute, I'm a judge. I'm not a sociologist.
Yeah.
I mean, what am I doing making social policy forecasts? Or if I'm going to do it, well, I should be reading more of the appropriate subject matter. I should be consulting with those people. But they're not supposed to, you know, that they don't do that. And I think they're not supposed to.
Yeah.
So it's
that kind of relates to the originalism and living constitutionalism debate, and how one ought. So in my mind, a judge really should be just, you know, his function is just pure garbage in, garbage out system. You know, you're not an adjudicator. It's how if the inputs are wrong, or, you know, they lead to disastrous results, well, then change them. You know, I'm not a law maker. I'm not making new laws of my own. And when it comes to these sort of problematic expressions, such as you know, using expressions such as reasonable force, what is that one about? Harm, unusual punishment. These sort of predicates. I mean, one thing that I don't think a judge is necessarily in a better position than other people in other domains of law to determine the right answer. So at the very least, and this is what Scalia would you know, he was proposing, that at least they should be determined democratically rather than put in the hands of the judges. So I don't know. So what do you think about that?
Well, yeah. So I think that part of there was judicial activism, especially from the liberal side of it. So they wanted to I think many of them thought there would be a good result to make to make abortion permissible across the country, independently of what the states were saying. So you just override. And so they the Roe v. Wade was said it, seemed to contrive this answer out of privacy considerations, and many people were unhappy with that because it looks like it's a kind of a strange detour. That never sat very well with people. And then recently in the United States, as it was overturned. But there you have a reaction. They said, well, look, what was happening is that they had their social predictions. They said it was making good policy for women to be entitled all over the United States, regardless of what the state had to say about it, to abortions under these certain conditions. And then the suspicion was they simply rationalized the privacy story to get that result. And then people like Scalia and these other conservatives, I think, well, they think, well, you've hijacked the legal process. You're turning us into legislators, crypto legislators, and so they want to reverse it, and they have reversed it. They slowly accumulated enough power, so they're starting to undo some of it. So that is part of the difficulty. The judges themselves, they're not naive. They understand what the other judges are doing. They're pushing social agendas. And if you have a theory where you're allowed to have a lot of judicial discretion, where is that coming? That does seem to be usurping a legislative function. So I'm not. So the garbage in, garbage out. One kind of thought is I'm not sure in what way you want that to go. But one idea is, look, I'm just going to rule according to what the law says. You don't like it, go change it. Mm. What I'm good at is figuring out what follows from what legally. That's what I'm good at. I'm not good at social policy. I don't have legitimacy in other respects. All I have is legitimacy of being a judge and being good at this stuff, what I'm trained at. So, okay. So, so that is actually, they'll make and sometimes they're pretty overt. They'll just kind of just show you this is the logical conclusion of the premises that have been imposed on me. Mm. And what they do, I think they're kind of inviting people, will change the premises. That's what I think. Yeah, that was part of the appeal of these people who are reacting against judicial activism. They think, So I think it's an interesting angle. When I was thinking about it, actually, I didn't recognize the point you kind of bringing out that the judges themselves are, I think, aware that there's a certain amount of insincerity that they're forced into, and then lament kind of an overactive, because you're like, well, if I'm going to, once you start some insincerity, you tend to do more of it. I think it's one of the dangers. You start lying a little bit, and there's a tendency to lie more. So I'm okay with people lying a little bit, I don't, and if I was a judge, I think I'd be lying a little bit because I'd be forced to be decisive. But I can also see how I get corrupted by that. I could think I get used to it. I do it maybe excessively. And I can see other judges would not be slow to see what I was up to and want to intervene and restrain me. So how much insincerity can we tolerate here?
Mm-hmm. Now with the rise of AI and the developments that are going on in that sort of realm, do you think that we can have sort of AI in the future, maybe, at least in principle, take the role, so the judges become expendable, so AI takes the role and everything is determined algorithmically? You have your inputs, your outputs, and all the results are explicit. There is no speculative sort of reasoning and looking up there and try to come up with an answer for questions. Do you think that, at least in principle, do you think that's possible? I'm not talking about desirable and just possible.
I think in principle, but I have to confess that there was an experience I had when I was in Turkey that made me unhappy with this. I was there with my wife, and I was just in Istanbul, and I wanted to have a bus trip to Ankara, and it was a long bus trip, and I wanted to ride with my wife, ride together, and we could kind of, so I go to try to get the tickets electronically, and it forbids me from having a seat next to a woman.
In Turkey? Wow.
Yeah, in Istanbul, the software, and because I wasn't sure. I went down to the bus station, and I asked them, "What am I supposed to do here?" There was just no way I could get the ticket through the internet, so went there, and the agent just looked at me quizzically, "Just declare your wife a man." Nope, and that's what I did. I declared my wife a man, and we sat happily together on the bus trip. Okay, so I think what happened is that there were these pious rules, the bus company had to implement, and they're kind of going through, and the computer was more pious than they wanted to be, than anybody really wanted to be. But it's hard to have enough exceptions and so forth as trying to get an affordable piece of software going. And so it just had this crude rule. And then happily, what happens when you have is that you have people compensate for crude algorithmic rules. And they just lie to get around it. Now, that kind of lying was A-okay, and I think that part may have been okay. I didn't know the culture. I don't know what, sometimes people they flip out on things that speak small lies, so better find out. Could that have been like a big fraud or something? Hey, so I think I did right. Get someone else, guide you through, and then you kind of learn your ropes. And I know the next thing I have to do, that it's, anyway, so what I'm worried about with the AI is that kind of piety would get involved in the system. And I'd like to have some sort of intervention, or at least I have some compensation in the form of accepted lying to the computer. Now, I think as it stands now, we do have accepted lying. So instantly, a couple of days ago, I'll just say a US version of this. I had to try to, you fill out the paperwork ahead of time, so speeds things up. So I just needed to get my eyes checked, and the software was like this really inquisitive software, and it asked me about, the power, does anybody have a power of attorney for medical things? And so, yeah, I mean, I filled out that kind of stuff, and they say, well, upload it. Well, I'm not, I don't have an uploadable. I guess I could, get the lawyer to cough up and after some billable hours later, I would have my power of attorney set thing, medical power of attorney, so I can get the eye appointment. But I'd rather not have the eye appointment than to go through the billable hours. So I went down there and I just talked to the receptionist, and I point this out, and what they do is, well, look, then you got to lie on this one. You have to declare you don't have the power of attorney. Dope. And then okay, well, I'm guided along. Okay, that's fine. So I think I was a little concerned because once it was lawyerly kind of stuff, and the mystery of what could be going on with the power of attorney business. But once I had the receptionist there with all her authority as the medical receptionist, guiding me through the right kind of lies to tell, I was okay. I was golden.
Yeah.
So so it depends on how you're envisioning the system. When you said in principle, you think, well, is there recourse? Do I get to compensate for problems with the AI system? So there are these horrific. Nick Bostrom has a it's one of his existential threats he talks about. He thinks that you could have these runaway computer things where the computer is following rules, but not in the way you thought they were going to follow them. And they wind up creating havoc, rule-following havoc. And they can stop you from intervening. And then that's the problem. If there's no, and he has chapters on like difficulty of just pulling the plug on some of these things, that they're wary of getting their plugs pulled. And because they worry, there's going to be a hacker or something like that. And so they tend to go off on their own, Now, at the same time, I also, that just normal human bureaucracies have the same kind of difficulty. Daniel Ellsberg in the Doomsday Machine, essentially the Americans have just set up, and they're not unique, the Russians have it too, as a legacy of the Soviet, a system that will just sort of go off on its own in response to a nuclear attack or a sufficient threat of it, and it's a machine, but at a bureaucratic machine. And basically what's happened is that they've delegated so much authority to ordinary, submarine commanders and so on like that, that it can't be the case. In the past, you've had some cases where people have shown restraint. Some very impressive cases by the Russians who showed restraint and did not manage to get shot over it. But that was heroic. How much, once you have enough people, there are going to be these people who do it. And so he thinks it's just a terrible, and there you don't have it isn't so much of a computer, it's just a human organization in control of this terrible power, because of this crazy arms race-y kind of thing, it's happened. And anyway, so he's very pessimistic. And so he spends all his energy trying to undo the Doomsday Machine. Not that optimistic about it. So, right. So I read the book and suddenly I was like pretty worried about global warming, it's like that. I think, well, we should be so lucky. Given the way Ellsberg was writing, well, we would have a nuclear disaster before that happens. Competing disaster scenarios. Okay, so with all that, emotional clouds I've thrown over the AI stuff. Essentially I don't, it does seem kind of scary.
All right. Because you mentioned in your last paragraph of your paper, vagueness has no function in law. This is, I'm quoting you here. So you say, if the adjudicators recognize the moral threat posed by vagueness, they will take actions to avoid borderline cases. So what sort of actions could a judge take?
Well, I think that one of the things they should be doing is what they already do is they start to substitute language that has more borderline cases for languages that have less borderline cases, and they I think it's also it would be good, I think, if people if there were legal reforms that made people more content with uncertainty and more acceptance of decision making, randomized decision making. So part of it is to try to avoid the problematic cases by judicious use of more precise terms or phrasing things around so that you won't run into them. And there's some of that goes on. Some of what they talk about, some of the void for vagueness stuff seems to me it is mostly they were worried about things being insufficiently specific. And too much scope for abuse. But in other cases, I think they are worried about there just going to be too many of these absolute borderline cases. They have both concerns. And so there you can do things. You can, legislators too can do things. They can be careful about what kind of language they introduce. And so one of the things you can do, for instance, is if you can incorporate more scientific vocabulary and allow that to guide so there's more appeal to natural kinds. So it's controversial law. So sometimes law seems to be doing that. For example, there had been a tax on fish oil, and it was applied to someone who had whale oil. And the guy said the tax doesn't apply to me because a whale isn't a fish. And now, at the time, this is like a 19th century US case. At the time, it was a jury trial, and the jurors all agreed, oh, whale's a fish. You can have your Harvard biologist come in here and tell me, Harvard biologist says the whale's no more a fish than I am. But I'm a sensible American, ha, ha, ha. You know? And so they all unanimously say, but that was too embarrassing for the New York legislature, and they undid it. But the Americans are not really that consistent about it. So take the tomato. You know, in some states they rule it a vegetable, and sometimes it's a fruit. Now it's a fruit botanically, but this New Jersey wants to be says its state vegetable is the tomato, and so they insist, you know, and then another, you know, other people will insist, you know, like Oklahoma or somewhere, it says it's a fruit. They just have, but it seems to me that you're better off inventing things. You shouldn't say there's too much legal fiction straying from the guidance that science has to offer on these issues. It is true that for cooking purposes, people tend to think of tomato as a vegetable. But, you know, they're also doing things like they talk about that they have tin foil, but it's aluminum foil. You know, they call it tin foil, aluminum and tin. So, I mean, I'm not going to get that upset, but I think what should be, if you align yourself better with science and encourage other people to get into better alignment, you will have fewer of the borderline cases. Because I think often nature is settling things that are not settled by convention. So the normal thought, where can I get this meaning? I could get it from conventions and people deciding, right? Or then you think, well, maybe reality can supply it, like the way the things are set up. The periodic table could be telling me that's aluminum and not tin or something like that. I got two things I can go for. Now, they're not sufficient, you know, but that is an insight. And we should, I think it would be helpful, law was be more welcoming of efforts to bring the language into a stronger accord with scientific language. And you can bring in experts, people can start make it predictable. You don't have to have like state pride dictate how the thing is going to be ruled, you know, So that'd be,
that'll reduce the amount of the gray areas in law, and also the amount of discretion needed, really. But it's still, it's like, so now that you've said it, so sort of Putnam came to my mind, and his view of like social externalism, and especially when dealing with like natural kind terms. But there are terms that are much more subjective and relative when you're talking about whether or not X is relative or X is offensive, or, you know, if you read laws regarding sort of hate speech and that sort of thing, man, I don't know what to do with it. You know, I don't know how to follow it, even if I wanted to, you know. So it's quite complicated in that sense, because there isn't at least genuine purpose behind it to, you know, regulate certain behaviors, but you use these sort of expressions that are just so broad and indeterminate that one really doesn't know really how to essentially follow it, and it creates a lot of chilling effects. So I remember when I was in the UK, I was living in Brighton at the time, and have you been to the UK before?
Oh yeah,
yeah. So if you've been to the train station, if you sit there and for a while, you will hear this announcement: if you see something that doesn't look right, please do report it immediately. And just
the U.S. has the same sort of announcements, really? You know, inviting you to be an informant in the airports. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the amount of devilish thought that came to my mind to just to just test them out, see how they'll respond to it, because that's a really huge problem. And on a more serious side, being from where I'm from, um, like I would see on a daily basis how a authoritarian and a totalitarian regime could abuse these laws, and I see them, and I've had people close to me, go away because of it. So that's why I have this maybe a naive ideal sort of language view of law, that sort of before we had like Russell Frege, that was sort of envisioning this sort of ideal language of natural language, we could sort of get rid of sort of clean out those sort of pseudo problems and things of that sort. Do you think I'm kind of misguided of trying to get to that direction, or what do you think?
I'm very sympathetic that this that kind of vague language seems gratuitously vague, and there's this. So people want to use law to solve a lot of problems, and so they by putting in this kind of capacious language, you can. But it's law is like a terrible machine that you can turn on people, and it's just awful what people will do, and it's just so people are constantly innovating and trying to get the law to do these things. And so some people actually have incidentally defended the use of vagueness because of the chilling effects. They think it'll be what happens is I can't really predict too well. And so I'll play it safe.
I'll be on the safe side.
And they tend to, and then you trot out some examples where it's nice that people are playing it safe. But then you have to, like an economist, you have to be thinking about the other case. You have to look at the opportunity. So I mean, if there's a traffic rule says you can't drive fast, that's some guidance, but I don't really know it. And I suppose it's a very strong fine or something. Well, what happens is maybe people will drive way too slow, and maybe there could be disadvantages to that. And so there's opportunity costs if you get these chilling effects going. I think the biggest attempt to try to show there's some functionality of vagueness is along these lines, where they actually say, well, it's an interesting kind of randomizing effect we have that can be, everybody's in like kind of a punishment lottery. And what you do is people are making choices in response to various chances that they'll get into trouble. And then maybe you have to tweak the system so that you're aware of, the trade-offs. Anyway, and I think maybe that will work in some of the cases, but then I would rather it be overt. Tell me that it is a punishment lottery, because then I know I can improve on that, because randomizing is not easy. I will get statisticians to run it and we'll test it. I won't have it done rough and ready, because people are terrible at statistical reasoning, unless they're they have to be trained and they have to be queued up to use it properly. And so, okay, fine. I'm open to it, but if it's going to be done, I'd rather it be open, it'd be explicit, and then conducted by the relevant experts. And there are for random stuff. Generally, people will not make it open. They mostly find it repugnant that there be chance that's involved in punishment. Though, in fact, I think that's quite a bit. That's what's really going on. David Lewis wrote a very good article on this, in which he basically that's what's really going on, and what gives the deterrent effect of these prison sentences, where you'll be thrown into dangerous prisons and so forth. That's part of the system. You'll have maybe you go in for a little while, and there's a chance you get killed in there because you can't adapt. That's part of the system, you say. I don't care for that. Maybe that's, in fact, if we're doing it that way, wanted to keep on doing it, let's do it, more accordance with expert advice on randomization and so forth, and economists who study how people really react. It is interesting how people really react, because it looks like they are surprisingly sensitive to the certainty of the punishment and how quick it's going to be. There are studies suggesting, like, you have like hardened gang members, and then if they face the prospect, that if something goes wrong, they're going to have to stand in the corner for an hour. That's going to be the penalty, but it's really confident that'll happen. Oh, man, I don't want to stand in the corner. Very tough people, So there's probably interesting psychology about that. What's disappointing is that if you just keep on jacking up the size of the penalty, and it's unclear to people, they don't react as you might predict. They don't seem to follow a good expected return calculation. It's got to, there seems to be much more influenced by a certain small size penalty than